Hello everyone, I'm Destiny and welcome to Biology Class 11. A little bit about Pre-Med Peers. If you recall, we're a nonprofit based in Virginia and we're here to help you with the MCAT. Today we'll be covering the respiratory system, complete with a passage as well as a brief introduction to the skin system. Here's an overview of what we'll be discussing today. Now we'll jump right into some practice. In mammals, what muscles are involved in inhalation? Answer to this question is both the intercostals and the diaphragm. The intercostal muscles are the ones in between the ribs or attached to the ribs, and the diaphragm is the one beneath the lungs. What happens to the blood when the carbon dioxide is not properly removed? Make sure to know this equation here, the bicarbonate equation. So, carbon dioxide buildup will cause a shift to the right to obtain balance, meaning more hydrogen ions and thus greater acidity. So the blood's pH will decrease. What is the correct path of airflow during inspiration? This one's pretty straightforward. Just make sure to read carefully. Pharynx comes before the larynx, and bronchi are the main ones. They come before the much smaller bronchioles. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a condition that results in ascending paralysis. If this condition becomes severe, it can cause paralysis of the diaphragm and intercostal muscles. Which best describes the impact that this paralysis would have on inspiration? Okay, so for this question, you have to know that those intercostal muscles and the diaphragm contract in such a way as to increase the volume of the lungs, which then, according to Boyle's law, means that the inverse happens to pressure. So that would create a decrease in pressure because volume increased. Now here it says create a negative pressure. By negative pressure, they mean less than the external environment and less than before. Which of the following is involved in gas exchange? Note that this question can also be read as which of the following is part of the respiratory zone. So all of these other options are part of the conduction zone. The alveoli are also very important in gas exchange, so definitely know this one. They're right next to those capillaries, and the diffusion is very rapid. Respiratory system and its functions. The respiratory system includes the nose, mouth, pharynx, larynx, trachea, lungs, ribs, diaphragm, and more. This system is responsible for air filtration, air conduction, and gas exchange. The gases we're most concerned with are oxygen and carbon dioxide. The respiratory system also assists in thermoregulation and pH control. Okay, let's look at the pathway of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The pathway of oxygen begins with the nasal or oral cavity. Oxygen then proceeds through the pharynx, larynx, and trachea. From there, the passageway divides into two branches called bronchi. These are also referred to as the main or primary bronchi. These then branch off into smaller and smaller bronchi, which branch off into the tiny bronchioles. From the start to the terminal bronchioles is the conduction zone. Then oxygen enters the respiratory bronchioles, which is the beginning of the respiratory zone, then into alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and at last the alveoli. From the alveoli, gases can be exchanged with the nearby capillaries. Oxygen is carried to the mitochondrial cells to act as an electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Drawing your own diagram of the process can be very helpful for understanding or solidifying an understanding of the big picture of the respiratory system. Note also that here you can see these orange arrows. That's carbon dioxide flowing in the opposite way of the oxygen. Okay, now we're going to look at the zones a bit closer. So, in the conduction zone, we have the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the terminal bronchioles. The nasal cavity, with its hair and mucus, filters the incoming air and humidifies it. The pharynx, larynx, and trachea act as passageways. Note that the trachea also has cilia for helping get rid of unwanted foreign particulates, and the larynx is home to the voice box. Bronchi and bronchioles continue the conduction until air arrives in the respiratory bronchioles, where gas exchange begins. This marks the beginning of the respiratory zone. The alveolar ducts connect the respiratory bronchioles to the alveolar sacs, which consists of a cluster of alveoli. Now we're going to take a look at the lungs. So the lungs are probably the first part of the respiratory system most people think of. These elastic organs are not identical to each other. The larger right lung has 3 lobes, upper, middle, and lower, while the left lung has only 2, upper and lower. The cardiac notch, a space for the heart, intrudes into the left lung. The pathways within the lungs can be visualized as an upside-down tree, the bronchial tree. Air from the trachea will travel down the branches into the alveoli and then into capillaries. Air with waste will follow this same pathway back out. In addition to this function, the lungs play a part in thermoregulation. We breathe in cool air, which equilibrates temperature-wise with the nearby capillary blood. Then we breathe out this warm air, thus allowing us to get rid of excess heat. Note also that the lungs never fully deflate, so inspired air and residual air will mix, lowering the alveolar oxygen partial pressure. Boyle's law states that pressure and volume are inversely related in closed spaces such as the lungs. This is sometimes communicated with the equation P1 times V1 equals P2 times V2. Thus, when the intercostal muscles in between the ribs and the diaphragm contract, increasing volume, this decreases the pressure. Air then flows from the higher pressure of the external environment into the lower pressure internal environment of the lungs. Upon relaxation of these muscles, there's a decreased volume and thus an increased pressure leading to exhalation. Now to take a closer look at the respiratory zone, particularly the alveoli. Each alveolar duct ends in around 100 alveolar sacs. Each sac contains about 25 alveoli. But what are these? They're essentially thin-walled air sacs in contact with capillaries, allowing for rapid gas exchange. These structures are prone to collapse due to surface tension, but they produce surfactant to counter this and keep the alveoli open. Let's look at the gas exchange occurring in the respiratory zone more in depth.
All cells need oxygen. It is the essential fuel which is necessary to enable cells to stay alive and to carry out their various activities. Bringing oxygen to the cells requires the uptake of oxygen from the air in the lungs, its transportation in the blood, and its delivery to cells all over the body. The first step is the taking up of oxygen by blood flowing through fine capillaries in the walls of the lungs' air sacs, or alveoli. The oxygen molecules change from their state as a gas freely circulating in the air, dissolving into a solution in the plasma within the capillaries of the alveoli. Once in the solution of the blood, 98% of this dissolved oxygen is taken up by passing red cells, leaving just 2% remaining in the physical solution unattached. Red cells are particularly well suited to transporting oxygen because they contain a special oxygen-binding protein known as hemoglobin. Each molecule of hemoglobin itself contains 4 molecules of heme, an iron-containing pigment, which binds oxygen loosely and reversibly. Hemoglobin that is fully saturated with oxygen is bright red and is called oxyhemoglobin. On the other hand, hemoglobin that is not saturated with oxygen is purplish-blue in color and is called deoxyhemoglobin. It is heme which makes it possible for the red cells to pick up oxygen dissolved in the blood, transport it combined with hemoglobin, and release it back into the blood as oxygen in solution, ready for delivery to the various cells of the body. Hemoglobin gives up its oxygen as red cells travel through capillaries in tissues where there is a low content or partial pressure of oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen represents the level of dissolved oxygen in plasma. As oxygen is released and again is carried in solution, the partial pressure of oxygen in the capillaries becomes greater than the partial pressure of oxygen in the surrounding tissues. This causes oxygen to move out of the capillaries into the tissues and to finally reach the cells. This graph, the oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin, shows why hemoglobin is particularly suited to its role in transporting oxygen. The oxygen dissociation curve demonstrates the relationship between the oxygen carried in combination with hemoglobin, the O2 saturation, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood. The sharp upstroke and the flat plateau illustrate how oxygen is released to the tissues over a wide range of conditions. Its shape means that although the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood returning from the lungs and being pumped out by the arteries may be reduced to only 50% of the normal value, say due to lung disease or high altitude, hemoglobin will still be 85% saturated with oxygen.
Hopefully that was helpful.
All cells need oxygen. It is
The pH of the blood ranges from 7.35 to 7.45. Bicarbonate is the major buffer of blood plasma, helping it remain in this range. If there are too many hydrogen ions, making the blood too acidic, respiration rates will increase to remove carbon dioxide, thus shifting the equilibrium away from the production of hydrogen ions. This equilibrium refers to the equation I showed you guys before, the bicarbonate equation. Conversely, if the blood becomes too basic, respiration rate decreases, carbon dioxide and carbonic acid increase, thus decreasing the pH to optimal levels. Now we'll move on to a different system. The integumentary system, also known as the skin. The skin is the largest organ in the body and serves many functions. First, the skin acts as a physical barrier between various pathogens, radiation, chemicals, and more. The skin is also a vital part of thermoregulation due to the action of sweat glands, insulation provided by hair follicles, insulation from fat, and usage of vasoconstriction or vasodilation as needed. The sweat glands play a part in another of the skin's jobs, osmoregulation. The skin also acts as a sensory organ and prevents loss of moisture. As you can see, the integumentary system is essential for maintaining homeostasis. You should also note that the hair, nails, calluses, and glands are all considered a part of the integumentary system. The first two both consist of harder keratin than that of skin. As mentioned before, hair allows for further thermoregulation as it helps trap air to provide insulation. Additionally, hair, nails, and calluses serve a protective function, much like the skin in its position as a barrier. Glands serve other purposes in the skin, such as thermoregulation through sweating or elimination of excess water, waste, or salt. Finally, we'll briefly cover the structure of skin. Skin consists of three layers: the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. The epidermis is particularly important for sensation, protection, keratin production, and repelling water. The epidermis is made of layers of its own called stratums. The dermis lies under the epidermis and also consists of its own layers, the papillary and reticular layers. The dermis contains blood vessels and immune cells, as well as nerves, glands, and hair follicles. Lastly, we have the hypodermis, also known as the subcutaneous layer. This layer is very fatty and thus heavily implicated in body temperature regulation. It also contains blood vessels and nerves. Okay, this is the passage we're doing today. It's pretty short. I would set a timer for about 8 minutes and then go through it. Okay, hopefully you went through those 8 minutes and you completed it. Here's question 1. Why might the experimenter have decided to take males of a certain weight? So let's go through this one. Answer choice A, to prevent attrition. Attrition is when somebody leaves the study midway through or at some point during the study. So this doesn't really have much to do with weight. B, to compare individuals with different oxygen requirements. Well, I would think that you would have more differences to compare if you had a larger range of people. So narrowing that range, I don't think would help with this, assuming that weight has to do with the oxygen requirements. C, to limit a confounding variable. This one makes sense because weight could be a confounding variable, and you want to make sure to account for this, and that's usually what scientists try to do. To focus the experiment on alveolar number. I'm not sure that that varies with weight. So that's why we go with C. We don't really use the passage much for this one. Which of the following is most accurate and complete regarding the functions of the lungs? I believe the real hint was and complete. The reason why is because when I first read this question, my eyes go immediately to A. This is the primary function of the respiratory system. We're bringing in the oxygen, we're getting rid of carbon dioxide, which is waste. But because we're not just looking for a decent answer, we're looking for the most complete. We keep going on, and then we find this one, to bring in oxygen and get rid of waste. This is true. Which of the following would be the most appropriate conclusion based on the results? So, at the end of the passage, there was a graph, and they seem to be inverse. Inspirational volume and respiratory rate, when one was low, the other one was high, and then when that one was high, the other one was low. So this is how we get at the answer that they might compensate for one another. Which muscle is involved in the prevention of the lungs collapse? So we could answer this one through process of elimination. However, you should know that the intercostal muscles are attached to the ribs and responsible for stabilizing the chest wall and the thoracic cavity in general. So that should give you an immediate answer, which is C. Which of the following best describes the pressure inside alveoli relative to the outside air when taking a deep breath? So in order for that oxygen to rush in, it wants to go down its pressure gradient. So that means we must start at a lower pressure. So we will get lesser when breathing in. And then for that air to rush out, it wants to go down to a lower pressure. So the lower pressure must be the outside environment, which means that the alveoli must be of a higher pressure at that point. That's how we get answer choice B. You could also use Boyle's law to some degree. Thank you all for watching and have a great night.